Hey guys, it's Randy with the Lowbuck LS channel here again. This episode is going to be a little bit different. A couple episodes ago I did kind of a year-end wrap-up for 2019 and also talked about some goals I have for 2020, and one of them goals was to increase my content production. So I promised to put out 50 videos in 2020 and a bunch of blog posts to go along with that. So videos will be coming out every Tuesday and blog posts will be coming out towards the end of the week, Friday or Saturday. And I did write a blog post for this week, but unfortunately I'm having some website issues. So I thought instead I would go out in the garage here and record a podcast. So something I've been thinking about for a while is starting up a podcast to go along with the YouTube channel and the content that'll be going up on the website. So it's super cold outside, so even if I've still got that fuel pressure issue to troubleshoot with the Lowbuck truck behind me here, but even if I did get that solved, it's like minus 26 and windy and miserable out, so it's not like I would be out taking it out for a test drive. So I thought, hey, let's go in the garage and record a podcast. So but first I wanted to do a couple shout outs to some friends of the Lowbuck LS channel. First of all, to Michael Narks with Narksoleptic, that's a hard word to say, Narksoleptic Customs. He's kind of the one who inspired me to start this podcast thing. He's starting up one of his own, so I'll put a link to his channel and his new podcast in the description below. And a few other guys I just wanted to mention. Kyle at Goat Rope Garage just passed 10,000 subscribers, so congratulations to him. Zeth with Dirt Floor Fab, he's having a giveaway on his channel right now, so if you want to go, he passed 1,000 subscribers, so congratulations to him too. And if you want to get in on his giveaway, I'll put a link to the video that he's doing that giveaway on. And there's also a gentleman we started up a new Facebook group for the Lowbuck LS channel, and there's a guy in there named Casey Cyric. Not sure how you say your last name, Casey, but he is doing harnesses and ECUs. I guess he's got a buddy or buddies that salvage trucks, and he gets the ECUs and harnesses out of them and thins out the harness and just leaves what you need for doing your swap if you're swapping an LS into another vehicle. So get in touch with Casey if you need harnesses or ECUs or anything like that. If you join that Lowbuck LS Facebook group, Casey's in there and you can private message him or ping him in the Facebook group. So I'll put a link to our Facebook group down there. And now let's get started with recording episode 0 of the Lowbuck LS podcast. Hey guys, welcome to episode 0, the pilot episode, or you could call it kind of a trailer of the Lowbuck LS podcast. So this podcast is going to be about getting affordable performance out of your LS engine, and it's mainly going to be focused on the truck engines, the 4.8, the 5.3, and the 6-liter Vortec LS engines. Or actually, some of the purists don't even consider the truck engines an actual LS engine because they don't have, like, they'll say an LS engine is like the LS1, LS2, LS6, LS7, but the truck engines have RPO codes like LM7, LQ4, LQ9, but they're still part of the LS family, and they're still an LS based engine. They're super affordable, and these iron block Vortec truck engines actually hold up to boost better than the aluminum block engines in the LS1 and LS3 and stuff like that. So that's kind of going to be what my main focus is getting affordable performance out of these LS-based truck engines. And we may touch a little bit on the transmissions that go behind them, the 4L60E, the 4L80E, and I haven't done any content on it yet, but I want to get into the TH400 or Turbo 400 at some point in the future. So I just wanted to introduce myself. My name's Randy. I'm the founder of the Lowbuck LS YouTube channel. So I just want to introduce this new podcast and talk about some of the topics I'll be covering on it. So there's a couple reasons I want to try start a podcast. One of them is there seems to be a lot of demand for accurate information on doing these LS swaps and getting affordable power out of these LS engines, putting a turbo and stuff on them. There seems to be a lot of inaccurate information out there on Facebook, so I want to try and help the LS swap and LS turbo community by putting out accurate information on how to do these swaps. And the other thing is, as you can probably tell, I'm not a great speaker, and I'm kind of an introvert in real life, so I want to get better at my speaking skills. So the best way to get better at something is by practicing and by doing it on a regular basis. So by cranking out an episode every week or so, that'll help my speaking skills and help me come out of my shell a bit. And I think it'll also be a good way to grow the following for the channel. And it's always good to have options as far as the way you consume your technical information, and I'm kind of planning on doing a series where I'll be going through the same content on the YouTube channel, and I'll have written blog posts, and we'll do a podcast about the same topics. So I'm kind of planning for the YouTube channel that up until this point, basically every video has been about me working on the truck or doing tuning on the truck. We'll still have that kind of stuff, but we'll also have videos like this where we're talking about technical content and how to do various things and sharing some information. So we live in a pretty amazing time to be a car guy. Like when I grew up in a small town in northern Alberta, the fastest car in town was probably like a high 11-second car, and that guy had spent a ton of money and probably got, 400-ish horsepower for all that money. But in this day and age, you can go to Pick and Pull or your local junkyard, whatever salvage yard you have in your area, and get a 5.3 truck engine for a couple $100 and put a cam and lifters in it for another $300 or $400 and have that same 400 horsepower that the old school guy got for way less money. And if you want to spend a little bit more money, you can bolt a cheap turbo on that 5.3 and get 500 or 600 wheel horsepower out of it. And with a few more upgrades and the right combination, you can probably get up to 800 or even pushing 1,000 horsepower out of a relatively stock 5.3 liter truck engine or 4.8 or 6 liter. And you're getting that 800 or 1,000 horsepower for about the same money that the old school guy spent to get his 400-ish horsepower. So it's a pretty good time to be in the car hobby. These LS engines are a pretty good opportunity, and they're not going to be around forever. Like you're already finding, like I know in certain junkyards in the States, they're getting picked through already, and you're finding less of these 5.3 and 6 liter and 4.8 engines. And I know even where I usually go in Calgary to the Pick and Pull, like if a 6 liter engine comes in, you better be there that day, or it's going to be gone by guys who are looking for this cheap horsepower. So I wanted to talk about why these truck engines are so popular. Basically, they're a super versatile engine that can be swapped into just about anything. They're a light and small, compact platform that it's way smaller than like a Coyote or a Ford mod motor or anything like that. So they can be swapped into just about anything. Like they're popular with C10s, Fox body Mustangs, old muscle cars, like 80s G bodies like the Monte Carlos, and old Cutlasses, and I can't remember what the other G body models are, but there's also guys swapping them into Jeeps and like the import little Japanese cars like 240 SXs and Miatas and RX-7s and stuff like that. And then you also see some fairly unique LS swaps, like in our Facebook group. There's a guy who swapped, put an LS in like a Land Rover Discovery, and there's another guy that's put one into like a rock crawler or rock bouncer. Like it's basically a full tube chassis, 4-seat off-road buggy, and he's using one of these LS-based truck engines. So there's all kinds of platforms that these engines are a good fit for. Or Michael Narks with Narks Electric Customs. He's swapped these LS engines into like an old school Toyota Land Cruiser, mid-60s C10, and he's starting a project where he's swapping one of these engines into an old school Jeep Grand Wagoneer. So the options are just about limitless as to what kind of vehicles you can put these engines into. Or you can just leave it in the vehicle that it came in, like the truck behind me. That's my project that I call the Lowbuck truck. It's a 2000 Chevy Silverado with the 5.3 liter that came with it. But it's got VS Racing 78-75 turbo on it, and a few other things done to it. I also want to talk about what I mean by Lowbuck. When you hear the name of my channel, Lowbuck LS, or when you hear the name of this podcast, you might think that means that I want to do things as absolutely as cheap as possible all of the time, and that's not the case. I'm not always about doing things the cheapest way possible. I'm more about getting bang for the buck. Like, if I could spend a little bit more money and get a lot more performance, I'll take that all day over doing things the cheapest way possible and getting mediocre performance. So being low buck is more about getting maximum horsepower per dollar than doing things the cheapest way possible. So here are some of the topics I want to talk about on this podcast in upcoming episodes. The first thing I want to cover is kind of the evolution of these Vortec truck engines, the 4.8, 5.3, and 6 liter, and kind of talk about how they evolved through Gen 3 and Gen 4. I'm not going to get much into the Gen 5 things because they are not low buck, but I want to cover like what all those different RPO codes mean, like the LM7 and LQ4 and LQ9, and which of those are best for an LS swap or LS turbo project, and how to identify those at the junkyard, how to tell if they're a Gen 3 or Gen 4, what the different features are of like some of them are have a cable operated throttle, some of them are drive-by-wire and have an electronic throttle, and some of them have flex fuel. But I kind of want to create a guide of what the different models of these truck engines are, and the pros and cons of each, and which ones to look for when you're hunting for a donor in the junkyard. After that, I'd like to do an episode on the generations of computers in these Gen 3 and Gen 4 truck engines, from the P01 to P59 and E38 and E40 and E67, and kind of do the same thing. Discuss the pros and cons of each and what features each ones have, and which ones are best for a candidate for your swap, and how to tell them apart. I also want to talk about whether you should keep the stock ECU or go with something like the Holley Terminator X or something like a Mega Squirt, and talk about the different methods of tuning. Like with the stock ECU, you can use HP tuners or LS Droid on the old Gen 3 stuff, or in the future I want to cover the Holley software as well, but I don't actually have a Holley Terminator system yet, so that'll be down the road some. Another thing I want to cover in a future episode is setting goals for your project, and why it's important to do that at the start of your project before you start buying parts and stuff, because a lot of the decisions that you make with regards to your project, like the type of fuel you're going to run, the size of your injectors, the size of your fuel pump, the size of your turbo, all of that is going to depend on what your goals are for the project, and even stuff like which transmission you want to run and all that. It all depends on what your goals are for the project. Like your goals might be, like Matt Happel with Sloppy Mechanics says, just a vehicle to go out and get ice cream and do burnouts, or you might have a certain horsepower goal or a certain ET goal. Like for my Lowbuck truck, I set a goal of running 1150s in the quarter mile, so that all factors into what size of injectors I need and what size of fuel pump I need and what kind of fuel I run and all that. So we'll go over how to set those goals for your project. Then we're going to do an episode talking about power adders for your LS engine, and we're going to compare the turbos versus superchargers versus nitrous and talk about the pros and cons of each and why I chose what I did, and the one thing that I hate about my LS turbo truck. And then for the rest of the series, this is probably just going to be like a podcast season. Like, I don't know, we might do 6 or 8 or 10 episodes and then take a break and see how things go. But for the rest of the season, we'll focus mainly on turbocharging because that's what I have the most experience in. I've never actually owned a supercharged or nitrous vehicle, but I do own the Lowbuck turbo truck, so that's kind of the direction we'll go in for the rest of the season. So I'll do an episode on choosing a turbocharger for your LS project, how to size it, and how to size the wastegate. And we'll talk about some different tools for choosing a turbocharger, the old school way, kind of the textbook way of sizing a turbocharger using compressor maps. Borg Warner has a tool on their website that's useful for sizing or choosing a turbocharger. We'll go over how to use that, and we'll talk about why sometimes those tools don't work, and we'll also give some recommendations on some companies that can help you out when it comes time to choose a turbo for your LS project. Then I want to do an episode on designing and fabricating the hot side for your turbo system. I want to talk about what your various options are, like the building your own log manifold. There's a few different options as far as a pre-made log manifold. There's some guys that use the truck manifolds and flip them over and fabricate their hot side from that, and then using tubular headers, and we'll talk about the pros and cons of each, and wastegate design, like where the wastegate should be in your system and how to optimize it. Then I want to do an episode on fuel system design. We'll talk about how to do some calculations and figure out what size of injectors you need and what size of fuel pump you need. And we'll talk about various options for your fuel pump, like upgrading the in-tank pump in your stock tank, which is what I did on my truck, or some options for external fuel pumps. We'll talk about your options for fuel injectors, from running decap truck injectors to snake eater performance injectors. I've heard good things about them. To the more high-end injectors like Injector Dynamics and stuff like that. We'll talk about why having correct injector data is important, and we'll talk about designing the rest of your fuel system, like your main fuel line and your return fuel line, and what size they should be, and whether you should run a returnless system like some of the Gen 4 trucks, the like 04 and newer, run a returnless system with a fuel pressure control module. Those ones don't have a return line, so we'll talk about if you should convert that to a returnless system, and we'll talk about fuel pressure regulators as well. And while we're on the topic, we'll talk about what fuel you should run, whether you should run pump gas or E85 or race gas, and what the pros and cons are of each of those different kinds of fuel. I also want to talk about turbo lubrication and what the best practices are for plumbing your oil feed line and drain line for your turbo, whether you should run a restrictor on your oil feed line, what the different lubrication requirements are if you have a journal bearing turbo versus like a ceramic ball bearing turbo. And we'll also touch on the Turbo Smart oil pressure regulator for your turbo oil feed. Then I want to do an episode that talks about the various sensors on your engine and the electronics and wiring and ignition and all that type of thing. We'll talk about choosing a wideband O2 gauge and the different ways of tying it into your system. Like if you've got HP tuners and you've got a newer wideband O2, you can tie it in so it communicates over serial to HP tuners. Or there's a couple different ways you can wire it in so it uses the 0 to 5 volt analog signal. So we'll talk about the pros and cons of each of those different ways. We'll talk about installing a 2 or 3 bar map sensor. The stock map sensor on these truck engines doesn't measure boost, so we'll talk about which map sensor you should choose and why. We'll talk about whether you should keep your mass airflow sensor and what to do if you get rid of your mass airflow sensor. Because if you get rid of your mass airflow sensor, you'll want to install a standalone IAT sensor. And we'll talk about some best practices for wiring, like what size of wire you need for various devices and what wire to keep separate from other wiring. And we'll also touch on like spark plug selection and ignition coil selection for your LS turbo project. Then I want to do an episode on boost control. We'll talk about manual boost controllers versus electronic boost controllers. We'll talk about, for the electronic boost controllers, we'll talk about open loop boost control and closed loop boost control. If you're running a Holly, we'll talk about using the ECU for a boost controller. And we'll also cover when you start wanting to go a bit faster. The fast guys run like a CO2 bottle with dome pressure boost control. So we'll talk about how to set up one of those systems as well. We'll talk about intercooler selection and sizing. We'll open up the old can of worms debate about the air-to-air intercooler versus the air-to-water intercooler. We'll talk about how big of an intercooler you need and how to measure how well it's working, like measuring its efficiency by measuring the temperature drop across the intercooler and the pressure drop across the intercooler. Then I want to do an episode on camshaft and valve train selection for your LS swap or LS turbo project. We'll cover picking a cam, choosing valve springs, testing your valve springs, rocker arm and trunnion upgrades, how to get the right length of push rods for your LS project, and we'll recommend some companies that can help with your cam and valve train selection. Then I want to do an episode that talks about transmission and converter options. We'll compare the 4L80E with the 4L60E and the TH400 or Turbo 400 and talk about the pros and cons of each and what situation you might want one over the other. We'll talk about some internal upgrades for those various transmissions, like your clutches and servos and shift kits and dual feed kits and stronger shafts and that kind of thing. We'll briefly touch on torque converter selection. I'm no expert in that area, but we'll talk about some basics of converter selection, and we'll again recommend some companies that can help with your transmission upgrades and converter selection. And then I want to talk about options for your rear axle. We'll talk about doing the Ford 8.8 swap and ways of figuring out what the optimum gear ratio is in your rear axle. We'll talk about installing a locker or limited slip and different options as far as that goes. We'll probably touch on some rear suspension stuff like Caltrax and monoleaf Caltrax springs and traction bars and shocks. And again, I'm no expert in the area of suspension, but I will tell you what I do know. And then I want to do at least one episode, possibly more, going into the tuning. That's kind of my favorite area of working on these vehicles. I'm an electrician and an instrumentation tech, so kind of deal with some automation and programming type stuff at work. So doing the tuning on these vehicles kind of merges what I know from work with what I like about working on these vehicles. So I want to talk about tuning the stock ECU with HP tuners, We'll talk about installing the different enhanced operating systems from HP tuners, like if you're running a 2-bar or 3-bar map, that is a speed density tune versus a mass airflow tune. We'll talk about how to do that. The differences are between a speed density tune and a MAF tune. We'll talk about using your wideband O2, logging the error on it and using that to tune your VE table. We'll talk about power enrichment and boost enrichment and making sure those settings are right to ensure you've got the right air-fuel ratio when you're at full throttle and under boost. We'll talk about idle tuning after you do your cam swap. And like I said, eventually I want to get into some tuning with the Holley Terminator stuff, but that'll be down the road since I don't even own one of those systems yet. And then once I've got a few episodes under my belt and I'm a little more comfortable with this, I'm thinking about interviewing some other YouTubers in the LS swap and LS turbo space and talking to them about what projects they've got currently going on and what they can share that's of value to the guys on my channel. Also down the road, I'd like to get maybe some technical experts on, like maybe get the Snake Eater performance injector guy on, or somebody who's an expert on turbochargers or camshaft selection or something like that. So I've got big dreams for this podcast. The first few episodes are probably going to suck. I'm actually cringing at the thought of editing these first few. Like I said, I'm not much of a talker, but best way to get better is by doing something. So I'm just going to start cranking these out. And I imagine after I get a few episodes under my belt, I'm hoping that I'll get a lot better. And I'll probably look back on these first few episodes and cringe quite severely. But that's the plan anyways. That's kind of the content we're going to be putting out over the next few months. So that's what we've got coming up. So we're going to get started next week with that first episode on, we'll talk about the generation of the Vortec truck engines, the 4.8, 5.3, and 6 liter, and the various iterations they've been through and the pros and cons and which ones you want to look for your LS swap. So thanks again for tuning in to episode 0, the pilot episode of the Lowbuck LS podcast. So thanks again. We'll talk to you on the next one. Bye for now.